The morning her stepfather threw her trunk into the Dakota snow, the thermometer outside Bismarck read 14 degrees below zero. It was February of 1878. Maren Vance had turned 16 exactly 3 days earlier. There had been no cake, no kindness, no word of it spoken aloud at all. Only the ordinary cruelty of a house that had quietly stopped wanting her sometime in the last 3 years and had only now gotten around to saying so. Now she stood in the doorway, in her mother's old boots, the leather cracked across the toe, and she watched her own trunk tumble end over end down the porch steps and bury itself in a drift the color of bone. Garrett Stowe stood over it with his arms crossed, his breath rolling out white and slow in the killing air. He did not raise his voice. Men like him never needed to. The world had spent 40 years agreeing with everything they said, and a man grows quiet when he has never once been told no. He simply lifted one thick finger and pointed it toward the frozen horizon, toward the empty white nothing that ran out flat and endless to the very edge of the world. And he told her she had brought shame enough into his house and that she could make her own way now. Make her own way. As though there were a way out there to be made. As though the prairie in February were a thing a person could reason with. Behind him at the kitchen window, Edith Stowe stood with her hands folded against her apron. Her own mother, the woman who had carried her, who had once sung to her in a Pennsylvania kitchen that smelled of bread and wood smoke, and her father's pipe. Maren looked at her through the cold glass and waited the way a child waits, even when the child has stopped believing for her mother to come to the door, to say one word, to put one hand on her husband's arm. She did not come to the door. She did not say a word. She turned her face away toward the stove, toward the warmth she would keep for herself, and in that small turning of a head, Maren understood something that would stay with her to the end of her life. There are betrayals louder than any shout, and the loudest of them all is silence. She did not cry. That surprised her a little even then. She had expected, if this day ever came, that she would weep and beg. Instead, something colder than the air settled over her, and her mind, the strange, clear engine her father had built inside her, simply began to work. The trunk held everything she owned in the world. 2 dresses, both worn thin at the elbows. A heavy wool blanket that still smelled faintly of the cedar chest it had come from. Her late father's old claw hammer, the head pitted with use, the handle dark and smooth, where his palm had worn it down across 20 years of honest work. And $4 in silver coins, exactly 4 sewn that morning into the hem of her skirt, sent the autumn before by a grandmother in the East who had died with the second letter half written on her table. A 16-year-old girl, 4 silver dollars, a dead man's hammer, and the entire merciless width of a Dakota winter waiting in the white to swallow her whole. She bent down, brushed the snow from the lid, and took the leather strap in both hands. She did not look back at the window. She had already learned everything that window had to teach her. Then she leaned into the strap and began to drag the trunk down the road away from the only house she had, the runners of the trunk carving 2 thin lines in the snow behind her that the wind began erasing almost before she had passed. She made it half a mile before the feeling bled completely out of her fingers. She would learn later in pieces why she had been cast out. The story was simple the way the cruelest stories always are, and it was a lie from its first word to its last. They said she had been seen meeting a railroad worker behind the livery stable alone after dark. No one named the worker. No one needed to. It was the kind of accusation that required no proof at all on the frontier, because a girl's good name was the only property she was permitted to hold, and the moment a doubt was cast on it, the name was gone, and there was no court and no witness and no amount of truth that could ever buy it back. But the man behind the stable did not exist. He had never existed. The whole tale had been spun out of empty air by Lavinia Stowe, her stepfather's unmarried sister, a narrow, calculating woman who had come out from Ohio 2 years before with a hard mouth and harder eyes, and the particular bitterness of a person who has decided the world owes her a debt it does not know about. Maren's true father, Henry Vance, had left a small inheritance when the fever took him. A little money, a claim to good furniture, to tools, to a name that meant something. All of it set aside by law and by his last wish for his daughter when she came of age. Lavinia had wanted it, and the simplest way to take a thing that belongs to a child is to first make the world believe the child does not deserve it, and then to make the child disappear. In the brutal arithmetic of that country, the truth mattered far less than the convenience of a scapegoat. A lie that tidied up a problem was worth more to the people who told it than a fact that left the problem standing. Maren had watched it happen to her over the course of a single winter, the looks at church, the conversations that stopped when she entered the store, and she had not been able to stop it any more than she could have stopped the snow. So she did not waste her strength weeping on that frozen road. She had learned long ago that tears froze on the cheek and helped nothing, that grief was a luxury for people with a roof. Instead, standing there in the cutting wind, with her mother's thin boots already letting the cold into her feet, she did the only thing her father had ever truly taught her to do when the ground gave way beneath her. She began to calculate. Town lots in and around Bismarck were selling for $25 at the very lowest. And that was for the poor lots, the ones nobody wanted. A boarding house wanted $1.50 every single week, and that bought a shared bed and a bowl of thin soup and the privilege of being looked at sideways by the other boarders. $4 in silver would not carry her to the spring thaw in March. It would buy her 3 weeks, perhaps a little more if she ate almost nothing, and then it would be gone, and after the money was gone came the cold, and after the cold came the kind of ending the Prairie handed out to the unprepared without ceremony, without mercy, and without ever once raising its voice either. She needed a roof over her head, and she could not afford to pay for the ground beneath it. Those two facts sat in her mind like two stones, and she turned them over and over as she walked, looking for the crack between them. It was while she was hauling that trunk the last mile toward the settlement that the memory surfaced sharp and sudden as a struck match in a dark room. Some weeks earlier, she had been carrying water past the livery when she overheard the Maddox boys talking in the loose, idle way of young men with nothing pressing to do. One of them had an uncle down in Nebraska, south of Omaha, who had lived 2 full years in a dugout, a shelter cut straight back into the side of a hill. The man had paid not 1 single cent for the land, the boy had said, half laughing, because nobody in his right mind owned a bare hillside, and the uncle had wintered better and warmer than half the men in proper frame houses, and had laughed at them for it, besides. The notion lodged itself in her mind and would not be shaken loose. It walked the rest of that road with her, while her feet went from aching to numb, and her shoulders burned under the strap, and the wind found every gap in her clothing. A house that grew out of the earth itself, a house that asked for no money down, no deed, no man's permission, a house that cost nothing but labor. And labor she had. Labor was the one thing in all the world that no one had yet found a way to take from her. By noon, she had walked into the Northern Pacific Dining Hall, a long, low building near the rail line, where men in heavy coats ate fast and spoke little, and were gone again, and she had set her trunk down inside the door and asked the owner for work. The owner was a widow named Augusta Pell, a woman somewhere in her 50s with iron threaded through her dark hair and a flat level measuring gaze that seemed to take the full weight of a person in a single glance and find most of them wanting. She looked Maren up and down. She took in the cracked boots, the trunk in the doorway, the chapped knuckles, and the particular straightness of a back that has just been broken and has decided not to show it. She understood the entire situation without asking a single question. That was the thing about Augusta Pell. She had been poor, and she had been alone, and she did not need things explained to her. The work was washing dishes. It paid 35 cents a day and one hot meal, and the hours ran from before the first gray light until long after the last man had gone. Maren took it before the widow had finished saying the wage aloud. Mrs. Pell let her sleep in the unheated storeroom out back on a pile of empty flour sacks, stacked against the wall for 2 weeks until she could find something more permanent. It was charity dressed up in the clothes of a business arrangement, which was the only kind of charity a proud woman could bring herself to offer, and the only kind another proud woman could bring herself to take. Neither of them ever once called it what it was. Maren lay on those sacks each night with her father's hammer beside her head and the 4 silver dollars stitched into her hem, and she did not let herself cry there either because the storeroom wall was thin, and Mrs. Pell did not abide weakness, not in others, and least of all in herself. It was on her first Sunday off, the one day the dining hall closed its doors before noon, that Maren walked west out of town and found the place that would change the entire shape of her life. 3 miles along Apple Creek, where the water made a slow bend, and the spring floods of 100 patient years had done their work. The creek had carved a wall straight down into the earth. It rose a clean 9 feet, a sheer vertical face of dark Dakota clay, packed through with glacial till, and it faced south so that the low pale winter sun fell full upon it through the bare gray branches of a great stand of old cottonwoods that towered along the upper bank like the pillars of a roofless church. She stood at the foot of that frozen wall for a long time longer than the cold should have allowed, and the wind moved in the high branches above her and said nothing. The county recorder had told her when she had finally worked up the nerve to walk into his office and ask that, as far as any man knew, the land along that stretch belonged to no one at all. It was open territory, unclaimed, just dirt and water and trees that the rest of the world had not yet bothered to fence. And as she stood there, something happened that she could never afterward explain to another living soul, not even to the man she would one day marry. She saw it, the whole of it, finished and standing rendered complete in her mind as plainly as if it already existed in that bank and were only waiting for her to walk in out of the cold and shut the door behind her. To understand how a 16-year-old girl came to see such a thing, you have to understand her father. Henry Vance had been a builder. Not a famous man, not a rich one, but a man who could lay his hand flat against a length of raw timber and read the grain of it, the way a country preacher reads scripture, slowly with respect, certain there was meaning in it if you only look long enough. When Maren was 9 years old back on the small farm in Pennsylvania, he had dug a root cellar into the hillside behind the house, and he had let her hand him his tools while he worked the chisel, the level, the wooden maul, and he had explained every single thing he did and exactly why he did it, never once talking down to her, never once acting as though a girl could not hold the whole of it in her head. The earth, he had told her, crouched in that half-dug cellar with the dirt under his nails, is either your friend or your enemy, and which of the two it decides to be depends entirely on how you treat it. You cannot fight water, he said. You will lose. So you learn instead to work with it, to give it somewhere to go that suits you better than it suits the water. You cannot ignore the cold either, so you learn to use it to put it to work. And you can never, not once, not ever in your life, assume the ground will stay where you put it without your help, because the ground is patient and you are not, and it will wait you out every time unless you have given it a reason to hold. He had taught her to read the grain of wood, to tell green from seasoned by the sound it made when struck. He had taught her how to judge whether a foundation would carry the weight a man meant to set upon it. And he had taught her the one law above all others, the law he called the foundation. Under every other foundation, the thing the whole craft rested upon. Water always finds the lowest point. Then a fever had taken him in the autumn of 1874, 3 days from the first chill to the last rattling breath, and the world had grown a great deal colder all at once. Her mother, a widow on the frontier with a young daughter, and few skills and fewer choices, had married Garrett Stowe inside the year, because the alternatives were worse, and most of them were unspeakable. And the knowledge Henry had poured so patiently into his daughter had lain quiet and folded inside her, ever since waiting the way good seed waits all winter in the frozen ground, betraying no sign of the thing it means to become. Now at the foot of the bank along Apple Creek, with everything taken from her, it woke. She could see the dugout entire, cut straight back into the south-facing slope, 8 feet deep into the bank, perhaps 10 feet across. A front wall raised up from creek stones she could carry by hand. A roof of heavy cottonwood poles buried under thick prairie sod to hold the warmth. A door, a small window to let in the blessed light. If she did it correctly, if she was careful and clever, and wasted not one board, nor one nail, nor 1 hour, the whole of it might cost her $8 or $10. No more than that. Less than a single month in a boarding house. And at the end she would own it outright and own the patch of earth it sat in besides. She walked the 3 miles back to town that evening, with the cold biting through her coat and her plan burning warm and steady inside her chest like a banked coal. For the first time since the trunk had struck the snow, she was not afraid. She was occupied. And a mind that is fully occupied with a problem it believes it can solve has no room left over in which to keep its despair. She began to dig on the 3rd of March, 1878. The ground fought her from the very first stroke of the spade. The top 6 inches were frozen into a single, seamless shield of ice and clay, hard as a forged thing, and the spade rang off it and jarred her arms to the shoulder and did not so much as scratch it. She stood there a moment with the blow still ringing in her bones. Then she did what her father's logic demanded, the thing none of the men who later mocked her would have had the patience for. She gathered armloads of dead wood from along the creek, and she built fires against the face of the bank. Long, roaring fires that she fed all through the evening, and the heat soaked slowly into the frozen earth and softened a few precious inches of it. Then she dug like a thing possessed while the soil was soft, hauling it out by the bucketful and flinging it aside, racing the cold that was already creeping back to lock the ground solid again. And when it locked, she built another fire, and she waited, hugging her own arms against the chill, and she dug again. Burn, dig, hour upon hour in the black cold before the dawn, and again in the black cold after her shift at the dining hall had ended, and the last dish was dried and put away. She was sleeping perhaps 4 hours a night. Some nights when a fire took long to do its work, she slept less than that and walked to the dining hall in the dark with her eyes burning and her hands screaming and her mind still turning over the angle of a wall. Her hands were the first part of her to break. The blisters rose along her palms and the soft pads of her fingers, and they filled and they burst, and the raw weeping flesh beneath them scabbed over in the night. And then the worn handle of the spade tore the scabs open again, the instant she closed her grip on it in the morning. Her palms became a landscape of pain. She stopped being able to separate from the rest of her. She tore long strips from one of her 2 dresses and wound them tight around her hands and kept on digging, and the blood soaked through the cloth and froze, and she kept on. There was a night, perhaps 2 weeks into it, when she came as close to stopping as she ever would. It was past midnight, and the last fire had burned low to a sullen bed of coals, and her hands had swollen so badly they would no longer fully close, and the hole she had carved into the bank seemed to her in that black hour to be no bigger and no better than a grave, which was, after all, exactly the word every sensible soul in Bismarck had already used for it. She sat down in the cold mud with her back against the frozen wall of her own digging, and she let the spade fall, and the whole crushing weight of it came down on her at once. The cold, the endless dark, the bottomless loneliness of being a person no one in the world was waiting for. And underneath all of it, the terrible whispering certainty that she was a foolish, stubborn, abandoned girl who was digging her own tomb out of nothing but spite, and that they had all been right, and that she would die out here, and the wind would erase the marks of it inside a season. Her hand, moving on its own, found the hammer. Her father's hammer, lying in the dirt beside her where she kept it, always within reach, the way another girl might keep a doll or a letter. The worn, smooth handle settled into her broken, bleeding palm, as though it had been turned on a lathe to fit her exactly, and in a sense it had been because her father's hand had worn that handle smooth across 20 years, and her father's hands had shaped her every bit as surely. She did not hear his voice. She was not a girl given to fancies of that kind, and she would have distrusted herself if she had. But she felt the whole shape of his patience there, in the honest weight of the tool, and she remembered the way you remember a thing you have always known, that her father had never once in his life finished anything in a single night, that everything he had ever built had taken longer and cost more than he hoped, and that the only men who never failed at anything at all were the men who had been careful never to attempt anything worth failing at. She got up out of the mud. She fed the dying fire until it caught and roared, and she picked up the spade. That was the difference. That was always, in the end, the only difference. Not her strength, for she had little enough of that. Not luck, which had shown her no kindness at all. Only the plain refusal to stop on the one night when stopping would have been the sensible, reasonable, forgivable thing to do. The town, of course, had its opinions. The town always does. The first to share hers was Mrs. Pell. The widow noticed the ruined hands one gray morning as Maren stood scrubbing pots in the cold dawn light, the bandages soaked dark and the fingers swollen stiff as sausages. And she set down her own ladle and folded her arms and asked in that flat, hard way of hers that left no room to lie. Just what fool project the girl had gotten herself tangled in to ruin a pair of working hands like that. So Maren told her. She described the bank along Apple Creek, the southern face that caught the sun, the design she carried whole inside her head. She spoke of it the way the young speak of a thing they have fallen in love with, fast and bright, and certain, the words tumbling over one another, her ruined hands forgetting themselves and sketching shapes in the air. Mrs. Pell heard all of it out. Then she shook her head slowly, the way a person shakes it at a child who has not yet been alive long enough to learn the precise ways the world breaks people who hope too hard. Dugouts, she said, were for desperate men and sodbusters who knew no better, who had run clean out of choices and dignity both. They were holes that broken people crawled into. They were not under any circumstances for girls. A girl ought to be turning her mind to finding a husband, to finding a roof that another and stronger pair of hands had already raised, and would keep up, to finding a good man's name to shelter behind from exactly the kind of thing that had just been done to her, not crawling down into the wet dirt like an animal denning up against the snow. She did not say it to wound. That was the strange and terrible heart of it. She said it because she believed it down to her marrow, because every hard year of her own long life had taught her that this was simply the way things were and the way they would stay, and she could not for the life of her imagine a 16-year-old girl with bleeding hands rewriting the rules that had governed and confined her own youth. Maren thanked her evenly for the meal that came with the work. She said nothing at all about the rest. And that night when the dishes were done, she walked the 3 miles back out to the creek in the dark and she dug. But Mrs. Pell was only the first of them, and she was in honest truth by far the gentlest. The second was Conrad Voss. Voss ran the lumber yard at the eastern edge of town, and he had come over from Prussia in 1869, carrying with him, packed in among his tools and his ledgers, a set of fixed ideas about the one correct way a building ought to be made, ideas as rigid and unmovable and cold to the touch as the iron stoves he sold off his front lot. When Maren walked into his yard one bitter afternoon to price out a keg of sixpenny nails and to ask him, builder to builder, which species of timber would best resist rot, when it was buried down in the wet ground, he set down the pencil he'd been working across his ledger, and he looked at her for a long, slow, deliberate moment as though she were something simple and faintly sad, a thing to be pitied and dismissed in the same breath, and then forgotten by supper. Then he told her with the heavy patience of a man explaining the obvious to a child that he had built 17 proper houses in and around Bismarck. 17. He let the number sit, built with milled lumber and square true corners and shingled roofs the way a house was meant to be built by people who had a decent respect for themselves and for the families they meant to put inside it. And not one of those 17 houses, he said, leaning forward now, not one had ever been dug down into the freezing earth like the burrow of a frightened prairie dog. The moisture alone would finish her, he went on warming to the lecture, as men of his stamp always did. The damp that lived in the ground, that was the very nature of ground, would rot any timber she was foolish enough to bury down there inside of 2 years, 3, if she were lucky, and she would not be. And long before the rot ever got its chance, the very first spring melt would come and saturate the soil sitting on top of her, and the whole sodden mass would let go in the night and bury her where she slept. And even supposing by some miracle he could not credit it, neither rotted nor caved, it would still be darker than a root cellar and twice as damp, fit for storing potatoes and turnips, and nothing finer, and certainly not fit for a living human being to pass a Dakota winter inside of. He sold her the nails regardless. 50 pounds of them, $6, very nearly the last of the silver she had, after the few other things she would need. But he counted her coins out slow into his own palm with a small, tight, satisfied smile working at the corner of his mouth, and he made very sure as he set the heavy keg into her arms that she carried away with her the full understanding that she was throwing the last of her savings down into a muddy grave she had been good enough to dig for herself, and that he, Conrad Voss, had warned her and would remember warning her. She carried the nails out to where her trunk waited in the cold, and she did not argue with him, not one word, because she had already learned the hard way that arguing with a certain kind of man only feeds the part of him that needs to be right. She simply took up what she had paid honest silver for, and she walked away into the wind. The iron of those 50 pounds of nails dragged at her arms the whole long 3 miles back to the creek, and every single step of that road she turned over in her mind the inward lean of her walls and the gentle pitch of her floor, and not for one of those steps did she believe that he was right. There were 2 more men yet to come, 2 who carried far more weight in that hard country than a widow cook or a foreign lumber dealer ever could. One of them owned the richest land upstream and the hard-won respect of every farmer for 50 miles in any direction. The other owned something a great deal more dangerous than mere land. He owned the settled moral certainty of the entire town, and he was about to gather all of it up in his two hands and bring it to bear gently, mercifully, and with the very best of intentions against a 16-year-old girl with bandaged, bleeding palms and nothing in the world to her name but a dead man's hammer. But before either of them came, Maren had her walls to dig. And the truth that none of those four people could see, the quiet truth that would in its own slow time turn every last one of their certainties to cold ash, was already taking shape 3 feet down in the frozen bank of Apple Creek. It lived in the careful inward angle of a wall, in the patient invisible slope of a floor, things that only one person in all that country had been given the eyes to read. Her father had given her those eyes. And her father, 3 years dead and 3 years in the Pennsylvania ground, was about to win a long argument with the most respected men in Bismarck through the cracked and bleeding hands of the daughter he had taught at the bottom of a root cellar when she was 9 years old. She set the keg of nails down beside her trunk in the snow. She unwound the stiff, bloody cloth from her palms, and she looked at the ruin of her own hands once steadily, without flinching from it the way her father would have looked. Then she wound them again in fresh strips torn from her last whole dress. And she picked up the spade and she went back down into the dark and the cold of the earth. She was already in her own private heart, learning to call her own. The third man came on horseback, and he did not once climb down out of the saddle the whole time he spoke to her. Harlan Pruitt owned the land 2 miles upstream, 80 acres of good wheat that he had wrestled out of the raw prairie with his own back since 1872, and he carried himself like a man who had paid the full asking price for everything he owned and had the receipt to prove it. He had. The proof was right there in his right hand, where the first terrible winter on that claim had taken 3 fingers to the frostbite and left him with a thumb, a forefinger, and a knot of shining scarred knuckles that he never troubled to hide inside a glove. He had earned that hand, and he wore it the way another man wears a medal. He rode by Maren's excavation on a gray still morning in late March, reined his horse to a halt at the lip of the bank, and looked down into the hole she had by then carved 5 feet back into the earth. For a long while he said nothing at all. He simply sat his horse and studied the work the way one man studies another man's plowing, his eyes moving along the angles, looking with a kind of professional patience for the precise place where the thing would fail. Then he asked her, and his voice was not unkind, whether she truly understood down in her bones what a real prairie winter could do to a person. He knew, he had felt it close its hand around his own throat in the dark. The cold could sit at 40 below for 2 and 3 weeks together without lifting, he told her. It did not come and go like honest weather in gentler country. It settled in and it stayed, and it pressed down on the whole world like a thing with a patient and personal will. A girl out here alone needed a real house, double walls with dead air between them, a great iron stove she could bank and feed straight through the night, not a burrow scratched into a creek bank that the first hard freeze would turn into an icebox with a frozen girl inside it come the thaw. Dugout's Pruitt said, lifting that ruined hand a few inches off the saddle horn, as if the hand itself were the whole and final argument, were what ignorant people threw up in their first green week off the wagon when they knew nothing. They were a place to survive a single season, while you got something real and lasting raised over your head. They were never, he said, meant to be a home a person chose. And anyone who chose to live in one on purpose had simply not yet been out here long enough to learn what the country was willing to take from a body that gave it the opening. He had paid 3 fingers to learn it. He looked down at her hands, the bandages gone gray and stiff with creek mud, and Maren understood, standing there in the bottom of her hole, looking up at him against the white sky, that in his own hard, flinty way, the man was trying to spare her something far worse than the loss of a little pride. She thanked him for the warning. She meant it too as far as it went. And she did not stop digging the entire time she said it, the spade biting steadily into the softened earth so that he had to watch her work even as she thanked him. Harlan Pruitt looked at that a moment longer. Then he clicked his tongue and turned the gray horse and rode on upstream toward his proper house, with its proper shingled roof, carrying his certainty home with him, the way he carried his maimed hand, as a thing the country had charged him dearly for, and that he was not about to let any barefoot girl tell him he had overpaid. But the man whose words cut the deepest of them all did not ride a horse, and did not own a single acre, and did not need to own one. He wore black, and the whole town, Catholic and Protestant alike, called him father. Emmett Doyle had served the scattered Catholic families of the territory since before the Vances had ever arrived in it in 1875. And he had lowered enough of those families into that hard, reluctant ground over the years to believe with good reason that he knew exactly what it was that killed people out here. It was rarely he had come to think the cold itself. The cold was only the instrument. The thing that truly killed was the pride that walked a person out into the cold and would not let them turn back. The settler too proud to ask a neighbor for help. The widow too stubborn to give up a claim that had already beaten her. The young man who knew better than every soul who had gone before him, right up until the still morning, they found him sitting frozen and almost peaceful against his own doorframe. He cornered Maren after Mass one Sunday in the last week of March, out on the trampled gray snow of the churchyard, after the rest of the small congregation had drifted off home toward their dinners and their warm stoves. He had heard, of course, about the hole out in the creek bank. Everyone within 20 miles had heard. And his broad, kind face, as she stood and described the thing to him in her plain, steady way, moved through a whole dozen expressions in the space of a minute before it settled at last into the one she would come in time to hate above all the others. It was not anger. Anger she could have answered. It was not scorn. Scorn she could have turned her back on. It was concern, the deep, soft, patient, utterly immovable concern of a man who has already privately decided that he is right and who now wishes only to spare you the unnecessary pain of discovering it for yourself the hard way. Pride, he told her very gently, was indeed a sin and a grave one. But foolishness, he said, was in its way a worse one, because pride at least only damned the proud man himself, while foolishness sent its consequences rippling outward like a stone dropped in still water, to wound everyone who had to stand by and watch, and everyone who would afterward have to dig the grave and say the words over it. A young woman, entirely alone, 3 full miles from the nearest soul who might hear her if she ever cried out in the night, in a shelter made of nothing but dirt. What was to become of her, he asked, his voice as soft as the snow coming down between them, when the fever came, as it came to everyone out here sooner or later, when she could not rise from her bed to feed the fire, when the great blizzards came down out of the north and sealed her door shut with a drift for a week or 10 days together. And there was no living person in all that howling white silence to even know that she was in there dying by inches in the dark. And then he offered her the thing that he, in the true charity of his heart, honestly believed to be mercy. He could find her a place. A respectable family in town he knew of one that very week needed a steady girl to keep house and mind the younger children. Warm rooms with real walls, regular meals at a real table, the protection of a roof that some responsible man was charged with keeping sound over her head. He laid it before her as Christian charity, and the terrible thing, the thing she could not even hold against him, was that in his heart it truly was. But Maren heard running underneath every gentle word of it the exact same sentence the world had been speaking over her since the day she was born a girl. You are a girl. You are at the bottom of it, a problem to be solved, a thing to be placed somewhere safe and out of the way. You will live the whole of your life inside some other person's walls, and you will be grateful for them every single day. And you will never, not once, not ever raise walls of your own. She looked at the priest for a long moment in the cold churchyard, the snow gathering on the shoulders of his black coat and on the wool of her own thin shawl. She saw that he was kind. She saw that he was wrong. She had learned that winter that the two things could live together comfortably in the very same man. Then she thanked him for his concern in the same even voice she had used on all the others, and she turned her back on him, and she walked the 3 miles out to the creek through the falling snow, and she picked up her spade. 4 of them now. A widow, a tradesman, a wealthy farmer, and a priest. 4 different kinds of certainty, 4 different voices, 4 different rooms in the same house, and every last one of them telling her the same single thing in a different key, that the earth would be her enemy, that she did not understand the danger she was courting, that a 16-year-old girl could not, must not, and would not survive the thing she had set her hand to. She let every one of them go on being wrong in private, and she said nothing more to any of them because she had understood from the very first that the only argument that would ever truly silence such men was not an argument made of words. It was an argument made of dirt and of stone and of the long Dakota winter still 7 slow months off in the future, gathering its strength somewhere up north, waiting to come down and render its final verdict on the lot of them at once. So she stopped talking, and she built. The thing those 4 people could not see, the one thing that set her whole in the bank, apart from every collapsed and rotted and abandoned dugout any of them had ever shaken their heads over, was already taking shape in the careful, unseen geometry of the work itself. She sloped the floor of the main room toward the door, a slight, steady, deliberate grade so gentle that no eye coming in from the daylight would ever catch it, so that any water which ever did find its way inside would have no choice in the world but to run quietly back out the way it had come, rather than gather and stand and pool against the deep back wall and rot the place out from its bottom. She cut the back wall and both the side walls so that they leaned very slightly inward as they rose, a deliberate, calculated tilt, so that the enormous downward weight of all the earth above pressed the walls together against themselves instead of bowing them out and in. And every single night, before she would let herself lie down, however ruined her hands or her back, she took up a heavy flat board and she tamped those leaning walls, beating along their faces methodically until the dense clay packed down and locked hard against itself. And then she did the thing none of the 4 of them would ever in their lives have thought to do, the thing that came down to her straight out of her father's first law about where water goes when no one is watching it. She dug a second channel, a narrow, deliberate trench 8 inches wide and 10 inches deep, running the whole length of the base of the east wall from the deepest hindmost corner of the room straight along to the front door, and set just below the level of the main floor itself. Its single purpose was to lie in wait and catch whatever moisture might one day weep through the packed clay of the wall, and to lead it away quietly out into the open air before it could ever so much as touch the floor of the room where she meant to live. And outside in the open, she cut a second deeper ditch crossing away from her entrance, and running off downhill to take that gathered water and carry it down and gone for good. The whole of the system moved on nothing in the world but the steady, patient pull of gravity, exactly as her father had once moved water through a Pennsylvania hillside while a 9-year-old girl stood by and handed him his tools and learned without knowing she was learning. By the middle of April, the digging at last was finished, and she turned to raising the front wall. She could not afford milled lumber, not so much as a single board beyond the bare frame. So she gathered creek stone instead, hauling it up out of the freezing shallows of the creek, one heavy water-rounded armful at a time, until her back screamed and her bandaged hands left smears of red across the wet gray rock. She built the lower 4 feet of the front wall out of that gathered stone, and she bound it together with a mortar she had taught herself to make out of the dense clay of the bank and the dry, dead grass of the autumn prairie. She had found the right proportion through nothing but pure stubborn trial and repeated failure, batch after crumbling batch, falling apart in her hands before she struck at last upon the one that held. 2 parts of the dense clay, 1 part dry grass for the binding, water enough to bring it together into a workable mass, and not 1 drop more. It cured upon the stone as hard as any sack of plaster a man could buy for cash money in town. And it had cost her nothing at all but the long, stubborn will to keep mixing failed batches until she found the one that worked. For the door, she had to go back to Conrad Voss, and that was a bitter walk to make twice. He had a warped pine door standing rejected at the back of his yard, half its grain run crooked in the drying, and he let it go to her for $1.20, with the unmistakable air of a man performing a small charity upon a fool and being seen to do it. She took it without a single word and carried it home on her back. For the window, she had no money left at all, not a cent, and so she paid in the only currency she had left, which was labor. Mrs. Pell had 4 small panes of good glass salvaged the year before out of a building that had burned down on the far side of town, and she agreed to part with them in exchange for 2 full Saturday mornings of helping with the heavy laundry, the scalding water, and the sodden wet wool that left even a grown woman's arms aching for 2 days after. Maren scrubbed and wrung and hauled and lifted until the bargain was paid in full. And then she carried those 4 small panes the 3 miles home, wrapped in her last whole dress, as though they had been cut from diamond, and she bedded the glass into its rough frame with her own clay and grass mortar, and she sealed every last hair-thin gap around them with sticky golden pine pitch. She had gathered herself from the wounded cottonwoods until not one single thin breath of the prairie wind could find its way through to her. And then there was the roof. And the roof was the place where dugouts killed the people who built them. She knew it without anyone having to tell her knew it the way her father had known things. The desperate and the ignorant simply threw a few thin green poles across the open top of their hole and shoveled raw wet sod on top of them and called it done. And then the first heavy rain of the season turned all that piled earth to a ton of sliding mud and brought the whole sodden weight of it down in the dark upon whoever lay sleeping beneath. A roof, she understood, had to do 2 flatly contradictory things at one and the same time. It had to carry the enormous crushing dead weight of 2 full feet of wet packed earth above it, and it had to shed the very water that made that earth so murderously heavy in the first place. Get the one wrong and the roof starved and dried and let the cold straight in. Get the other wrong and the whole hillside came down on you in the night. There was no margin in it at all. She felled 23 cottonwoods for that roof, choosing her poles 7 inches through and cutting each one to a length of exactly 14 feet. Cottonwood was poor timber, and she knew it soft and quick to rot, and her father's remembered voice told her so with every tree she dropped. But cottonwood grew thick and free all along that creek, and a girl with the last of $4 sewn in her hem does not get to be a particular woman. So she fought the rot the only way that was open to her. She borrowed a draw knife from a neighbor of Mrs. Pell's, and she peeled the bark from every single one of the 23 poles by hand, drawing the longy, pale curling strips off until the naked wood gleamed white and clean as bone in the spring light. And then she rubbed each peeled pole down end to end with a deep, penetrating mixture of linseed oil and heavy black tar that she had bought together for $1.60, working it into the open grain with her bandaged hands until the timber was sealed against the very damp that wanted to feed on it. She laid the poles across the opening, 8 inches apart, span by careful span, reaching from the solid earth of the back wall to the new stone of the front, and she set each one with a care that came very near to prayer. Over the laid poles came the strangest layer of all, the one that had made the men who saw her gathering it laugh out loud. For 2 long months, she had been quietly hoarding old newspaper, gathering up every discarded sheet she could lay hands on from the dining hall tables and the floor of the general store until she had built a stack of them 3 feet high in the corner of the storeroom. Now she carried that stack out and spread the broad sheets across the timber poles in tight, overlapping courses, layer upon layer upon layer, building up a barrier that would slow any water that crept down from above to a crawl and trap a still dead cushion of air to hold off the cold. Over the deep bed of paper, she packed dried prairie grass, dense and tight as she could tread it. And over the grass, last of everything, last and heaviest, came the sod. The cutting of that sod very nearly broke her in half. She sliced it from the thickest, most root-bound ground she could find, cutting it into strips 3 feet long and a foot wide and 4 full inches deep, and each wet, green, dripping piece weighed close to 30 pounds in her arms. She carried them up onto the roof a few at a time, climbing the bank with the weight against her chest, and when her arms at last gave out entirely, she lay down with her face pressed into the cold-cut grass and waited, breathing until the swimming gray edges drew back from the corners of her sight. And then she got up and she carried more. She laid the strips down in 2 full layers, the second crossed at right angles over the first, so that no seam in the upper layer ever lay over a seam in the one below it, the way a careful mason laps his brick, so that falling water could never find a single straight, clear path down through the joints. When the very last strip was finally bedded into place, she could not lift her own 2 hands as high as her face. The whole of it tallied out to the last honest penny, the nails and the warped door, and the linseed oil and the tar and the window glass she had paid for in laundry came to $9.45. She moved into it on the 6th of May, 1878, dragging her trunk and a handful of empty flour sacks and one short stub of a tallow candle in through the warped pine door and pulling it shut behind her. And that first night, lying alone in the full dark on the packed earth floor, with the cold, wet smell of the close ground and all around her, on every side, the very smell of a freshly opened grave, for the first time since she had taken up the spade, the doubt got all the way in past her guard. She heard their 4 voices come to her there in the dark: the widow, the tradesman, the farmer, the priest. Foolishness sends its consequences rippling outward. A muddy grave you were good enough to dig yourself, and lying there in the bottomless silence, 3 miles from any other beating heart, she thought with a cold lurch of the stomach that perhaps they had every one of them been right all along, and that she had simply been too proud and too young and too freshly wounded to let herself hear it. Then she slept, and then she woke, and the earth without a word gave her its answer. Outside in the night, the temperature had fallen to 38 degrees, cold enough to lay a heavy white killing frost across every blade of grass on the open prairie and skin the still water of the creek with ice. She had built no fire. The little iron stove was not even bought and set yet, And inside the dugout, with not one thing burning anywhere in it, the air sat at a steady, gentle, miraculous 55 degrees. The great patient mass of the surrounding earth wrapped close around her on every side, and overhead had drunk in the warmth of the day before and was now giving it back to her slowly all through the long, cold night, asking absolutely nothing of her in return for the gift. She lay very still on the packed floor and felt that gentle warmth resting on her face in the dark, and she understood all at once and completely that she had just won the first round of an argument the whole town did not yet even know it was having with her. The men with their 17 proper houses and their 80 hard acres and their cast iron certainties had all of them spoken their piece, and the earth, without raising its voice, had quietly spoken louder than the lot of them. Summer, when it came on hard, the way every single thing came on hard in that country. By July, the sun stood overhead like a raised hammer, and the mercury climbed to 95, and held there in the dining hall turned into such a brutal oven that Mrs. Pell was forced to send her kitchen girls home early, twice in a week before the heat dropped one of them where she stood. Maren would finish her shift soaked clean through her dress and walk the 3 long miles home under that white punishing sky, and then she would step in through her warped pine door into a cool, dim quiet that held steady between 65 and 70 degrees no matter what madness the sun was working outside. The very same walls that had cradled the warmth through February now held the killing heat out through July. The earth did not know the seasons and did not care for them. It only kept faithfully its own deep, patient temperature, and it shared that temperature without charge with the one girl in all the territory who had thought to learn how to ask it. She made the cold hole a home that summer, a rope-strung bed frame against the east wall, shelves hung on rawhide from the heavy roof poles, a table knocked together out of scrap lumber, and 2 sound chairs earned like every other thing she owned with extra hours bent over the steaming washtub. And from a beaten family fleeing back east, broken at last by the country, and selling off the wreck of their lives at a loss on the road, she bought a cracked, but still working iron stove for $3 and hauled it home in a borrowed cart. She set it against the wall and ran its black pipe up and out through a hole sealed tight all around with her clay mortar, and for the first time in the whole of her life, she had a fire that was hers burning in a house that was hers, sitting on a patch of ground that no man living had given her, and that no man living could take. The first real test of the thing came in October, and when it came down like the promised end of the world. The rain began on the 17th, and it did not stop for 4 straight days and nights. It was the kind of rain that turns dirt roads into running rivers and turns rivers into something with teeth and a temper. Up and down the whole length of the valley, the country drowned. Conrad Voss stood at the edge of his pristine lumberyard and watched the brown floodwater pour through it and lift his neat stacked boards and float them away off down the current. Harlan Pruitt lost an entire storage shed bodily to the wind, and the water, the roof of it, peeling away into the gray sky like a torn page. 3 of the proper houses in Bismarck itself, 3 of the sound, square, shingled houses that respectable people built for themselves, had their cellars filled to the floor. Joists with brown, muddy runoff, while the family stood out in the downpour and watched their laid-in winter stores spoil before their eyes. And 3 miles to the west, in a hole in a creek bank that the whole of the town had pronounced a grave with one voice, Maren Vance sat perfectly dry and listened to the rain drums steadily on the thick sod 2 feet above her head. She watched through her 4 salvaged panes as Apple Creek rose. It came up out of its banks and swelled from a lazy summer 2 feet to a roaring brown 8, carrying whole uprooted trees down the middle of it, end over end, and it climbed the slope toward her door until the racing water stood within 30 yards of her stone threshold. She did not run from it. She had no reason to run because she had built for precisely this hour. The narrow trench along the base of her east wall, the one the men would have laughed themselves sick at, had any of them ever once bent down to look at it, caught the faint, cold seep of moisture, working its way through the back wall, and let it away quietly and entirely out the door, and down the outer ditch and into the screaming creek, every drop of it, moving on nothing but the patient slope she had cut into the earth with her own hands. In 4 full days of biblical rain, perhaps a single quarter cup of water ever reached her main floor. She wiped it up with a rag, wrung the rag into the trench, and went back to cooking her dinner over the stove. When the sky at long last broke open and cleared, Father Doyle rode out alone to the creek. He had come, she understood, the very moment she saw his face to bury her. Or if not quite that, then to stand in sorrow over the muddy wreckage of her foolishness and feel the heavy, dragging, righteous grief of a man who had warned and been kindly ignored, the grief that lives so very close a neighbor to satisfaction that the two can scarcely be told apart. He had come fully expecting to find a collapsed and sodden tomb, expecting perhaps to have to dig with his own soft hands for what remained of her beneath a slumped and ruined hillside of fallen sod. He found her instead hanging clean wet laundry on a line strung between 2 of the great cottonwoods in the bright washed gold of the after-storm sunlight, with her dry, sound house standing whole and quiet behind her, and her chimney trailing a thin, clean, confident ribbon of wood smoke up into the clearing skikiba. His horse stopped of its own accord. The priest sat the saddle and stared, and his broad face, that face so long and so well practiced in the arts of patient, sorrowful concern, came entirely and helplessly apart. Maren set down her wet washing, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked him down inside the dugout without a word of triumph. She showed him the dry, packed floor and the trench running dark along the base of the east wall, and the place at the door where the water went out and away exactly where she had told the earth it would go. And Emmett Doyle stood there in the cool, dim quiet of the underground room in his damp black cassock, turning his hat slowly in his hands, and he was silent for a very long time. Then he admitted it, plainly and out loud, the way an honest man does when the very ground has shifted under everything he thought he knew. He had been wrong. The structure was sound. He had presumed in his pride to know exactly what a young woman was and was not able to do, and the young woman had stood up out of the mud and shown him the precise and humbling measure of his error, and there was no honest road around the fact of it. But at the door, before he climbed back up into his saddle to ride home, he turned, and the old worry came back up into his eyes one final time, and this time she saw it was not pride that had put it there. It was the long memory of all the graves. The rain, he told her quietly, was not the thing that killed people in this country. She had beaten the water, and that was no small thing, and he would say as much to any man in town who would hold still to hear it. But the water, he said, was only ever the gentle test, the easy examination. The real one was still out there ahead of her, somewhere out beyond the bright, innocent October sky, gathering its full strength up north in the country where the cold itself was born. The Dakota winter. That, he said, was the only judge whose verdict had ever truly mattered, the one that had filled every grave he had ever stood over with his book open in his hands. And it had not yet so much as opened its mouth to speak. He rode away east toward the town growing small against the wet, shining prairie, and Maren stood alone in her dooryard in the clean, cold, washed air and watched him go. And far to the north of her, though she could not yet feel the first edge of it on her skin, the temperature had already quietly begun to fall. The wood was the thing that very nearly killed her in the end, and it was not the cold that did it. It was one single careless choice about where a person ought to keep it. All through the bright, shortening days of October, Maren had cut fuel against the winter the priest had promised was coming for her. Dead cottonwood, elm, and ash dragged in from along the creek and sectioned with a borrowed crosscut saw into lengths cut to fit the cracked iron mouth of her stove stacked up just outside her door until the pile stood a full 6 feet high and 8 feet across. She covered the whole of it over with a heavy canvas tarp she had scavenged off an abandoned heap of railroad goods down near the tracks, and she stood back and looked at that great wall of split fuel in the evening light, and she let herself feel for one whole evening something she had not felt since the trunk hit the snow, something close to safe. She had stacked it the way every settler in that whole country stacked his wood. Outside the door under canvas, up off the wet ground, exactly the way the men with their 17 houses and their 80 acres kept theirs. And that, it turned out, was the one mistake she had left herself open to make. On the 12th of November, a light snow fell, no more than 2 inches of it, soft and harmless looking, and by the afternoon it had melted clean into the canvas tarp and soaked it through and through. Then the temperature dropped that evening, the way it dropped in that country, all at once, and without one word of warning, the mercury falling like a stone down a well, and the wet outer layer of her whole critical woodpile froze solid into a single impenetrable block of ice. The split logs locked inside it like teeth set in a frozen jaw. A girl who had grown up handing tools to a builder knew exactly what wet wood meant in a Dakota winter. It was no mere inconvenience to be grumbled at. It was a slow death sentence read out quietly. Green or frozen wood gives off a blinding, choking smoke and yields barely half the honest heat of properly seasoned timber, and a stove choked and stuffed with the stuff burns hard and fast and gives back almost nothing, devouring a person's whole supply while the room around it stays stubbornly cold. She was forced now to break the frozen logs free of the block, with the back of an axe haul them inside and stand them dripping and steaming in a row by the stove to thaw and dry, which meant that she was forever burning today the very wood she had meant to be drying for tomorrow, forever a full day behind herself, forever feeding her fire something half ruined, while the next armful sat thawing into a cold puddle on her good dry floor. She fought it. She restacked the whole great pile twice over, building it differently each time, angling the wet canvas to throw off the snow before it could melt and soak. But the storms were coming faster now, one crowding in on the heels of the last, with hardly a clear day between them, and the snow kept melting into the cover and freezing again by night. And Conrad Voss wanted a full $1.20 for a new tight canvas tarp that would shed the wet money she simply did not have and could not begin to spare, with her wages from the dining hall already thinning down toward nothing. Harlan Pruitt rode by once during that hard stretch and saw her out there battling the frozen block of her own woodpile, and he reined up and offered her the obvious answer, the plain, practical answer that any sensible man would give. Bring it inside. Stack the wood in the house where the weather simply cannot reach it. But she had 8 feet by 10 of living space and not one spare inch of it to give, and a winter's worth of split wood brought in through that door would crowd her clear back to her own bed and turn her single small room into a dry tinderbox waiting on one stray spark from the open stove to take the whole of it and her with it. She thanked him for the thought. She did not do it, and the problem settled itself down onto her chest every single night after that, like a cold flat stone, and would not let her sleep. There was an evening late in that bad November that was very near the worst of all of them. The wind was screaming down off the open prairie and finding every gap she had thought she had sealed, and the fire was sputtering and dying on a stick of half-thawed elm that gave back far more bitter smoke than honest warmth. And Maren sat alone at her scrap lumber table with her smoke-stung, streaming eyes and her cold feet drawn up under her, and she felt the whole brittle, careful structure of her survival begin quietly to come apart in her two hands. She had beaten the four of them. She had beaten the flood that drowned the town. And now, after everything, she was going to be beaten by something as small and as stupid and as ordinary as wet firewood. She was going to spend the long, killing heart of the winter slowly, surely losing the daily race between the wood she could dry and the cold that wanted her dead. And one gray morning, soon she was simply not going to be able to get the fire to catch at all, and that would be the quiet end of it. And the priest would be proven right after all, and there would be no one within 3 miles to even know. She sat staring at nothing, too bone-tired by then even to be properly afraid. And the nothing she happened to be staring at was the long, narrow, dark line of the drainage trench running the whole length of the base of her east wall, just below the level of the floor. The very channel that had carried the great October flood safely past her sleeping feet and saved the whole house. It lay there in the low yellow lamplight, dry and clean, and entirely perfectly empty. Empty. And it would stay empty, she realized slowly, for 6 full months. There was no water to drain in the dead of a Dakota winter. Nothing moved through that trench from the first hard November freeze until the spring melt finally came again in April. The single most important piece of engineering in her entire house, the thing that had defeated the flood, was about to sit completely cold and useless straight through the exact season she had the most desperate need of it. And then she saw it. All at once, entire and finished the way she had once stood at the foot of a frozen creek bank with nothing to her name, and seen a whole house standing where there was only raw dirt. She did not sleep that night at all. The next morning, she walked the long road into town and into the lumber yard and bought 8 feet of plain pine board off Conrad Voss for 80 cents. And she stood and made him rip it down into narrow widths on his own saw, while he watched her do it with the sour, folded patience of a man still waiting after all this time to be proven right about her. She carried the wrapped boards home on her back, and she spent the whole of that evening by lamplight, cutting and fitting and trimming, building a heavy snug cover for the open trench in short modular sections that she could lift out one at a time, sealing every joint where the new pine met the old earthen walls with her own proven clay and grass mortar. And when it was done, she had turned an empty ditch into a vault. She packed the trench tight from end to end with split bone, dry wood, dropped the fitted pine boards back down into their places over the top of it, and walked back and forth across them as easily as if they were nothing more than an ordinary floor. And below her own 2 feet, now sealed off entirely from the snow and the screaming wind and the soaking wet that had been killing her by inches, lay 2 full weeks of fuel dry as a bone and ready to burn. The deep ground that wrapped close around the trench held its own steady underground warmth and would never once let those buried logs freeze. And because the whole of the vault lay sealed inside the warm, insulated envelope of her own home, she could now refuel her stove in the teeth of the very worst blizzard the northern sky could throw down at her, without ever once having to open her door to it. It was enough. On its own, just that it would have been enough to carry her whole winter. But she pushed the thing one magnificent step further, and that single further step was the thing that would 100 years on make the men who study such matters set down their papers and shake their heads in something close to disbelief. She understood the way she understood all of it, without ever having read it in any book, that heat rises and that warm air, given any path at all, will move. So she took up her knife and she cut one small, deliberate, carefully placed opening in the back corner of the wooden cover, right at the spot where the buried trench ran nearest to the hot iron flank of her stove. And the fierce radiated heat coming off that cast iron, the heat that would otherwise have only gathered uselessly up against her low ceiling and bled away into the earth, was now drawn down through that one small opening and into the channel. It moved along the length of the buried wood in a slow, dry circulating current, baking the very last trace of moisture out of every split log, down there driving the damp out of tomorrow's fuel long before it was ever carried to the fire, and then it rose back up again into the room warmer for its journey along the floor. She had made the trench breathe. She had built a single thing out of an empty drainage ditch and 80 cents of pine board that dried her fuel and warmed her floor and circulated the heat of her one small fire all through the room at once. And she had done it with her own hands in a kind of seeing that no school in the world has ever yet found a way to teach. The true horror of that winter arrived on the 22nd of December, and it arrived the way a final verdict arrives with no warning and no appeal. The temperature collapsed to 18 degrees below zero, and it did not rise above the zero mark again for 11 straight days. This was no longer weather. This was the country at last showing its true and naked face, the same face that had taken 3 of Harlan Pruitt's fingers and filled one by one every grave that Father Doyle had ever stood over with his book open. The moisture in a man's own breath froze in his beard before it had fully left his face. Bare skin died quietly in under a single minute of exposure. Out in the dark groves along the creek, the rising sap inside the great old elms expanded as it froze and split the very trunks open with a sharp concussive crack, like a rifle shot all through the long black nights. The sound of a whole country tearing itself slowly apart in the iron grip of the cold. The town of Bismarck simply stopped. Mrs. Pell was forced to shutter the doors of the dining hall for an entire week together because no amount of coal or wood she could feed the stoves would lift the inside of that drafty wooden building to a temperature where a human being could stand to work. In the proper houses, the sound square, shingled houses that respectable people had raised for themselves, families burned in a panic through the winter fuel they had so carefully measured and laid by going through it at twice and 3 times the rate they had ever planned for, and stood helpless in their own front rooms watching the white frost climb steadily up the inside of their own bedroom walls, and began, some of them, for the first time to be truly and quietly afraid. And down in a $9 hole in a creek bank 3 miles west of all of it, Maren Vance was burning roughly half the wood she had ever budgeted. She started every single one of those killing mornings already warm. The deep ground at the depth she had dug down to held its own steady underground temperature. No matter what insane thing the sky above was doing, and so while the whole shivering town had to fight its desperate way up from 18 degrees below zero, she had only to fight her way up from the gentle baseline the earth handed her free every morning of her life. She lit the stove briefly at dawn, and once more again at dusk, brought the close, warm room up to a comfortable, even generous heat, and then the dense packed clay of her tamped walls held that warmth in and gave it slowly back for hours and hours after the fire itself had died down to coals. And the wood that came up out of her breathing vault burned hot and clean and almost entirely without smoke. While grown men with 20 hard winters of frontier experience behind them were reduced to feeding green fence posts and ice-crusted logs into stoves that could not catch and would not hold, a 16-year-old girl sat in a steady, quiet golden warmth and mended her stockings by the light of her one good lamp. By the middle of January, the deep cold had at last turned itself into something worse even than cold. It had turned into hunger. Mrs. Pell had reopened the dining hall once the worst of the freeze broke, but she had been forced to cut her staff down to the bone to do it, and Maren's hours fell away to just 3 days in the week. Her small cash income dried up entirely at the precise moment she most needed it to lay in more food against the lingering deep freeze, and for a few hard days she ate thin and felt the old familiar fear come scratching softly at the door again in the night. But her wood vault was still very nearly full to the boards, and she possessed the sharp, clear wits to understand a thing that the desperate so very often miss in the depths of their own desperation. Her trouble was money and it was food, but her wealthy, doubting neighbors had no shortage at all of either money or food. What those neighbors did not have, what they were burning frantically through faster with every passing freezing day, was dry wood that would catch and hold. On the 18th of January, with the air sitting at a flat, killing 12 below zero, she loaded a heavy hand sled down with a full week's worth of split-season bone-dry cottonwood, and she dragged it the 2 long miles upstream to Harlan Pruitt's grand and freezing estate. She did not come to his door as a beggar, and she did not come to it to sell. She came to trade fair and open and level the dry wood for whatever provisions the man himself judged it to be honestly worth. Harlan Pruitt opened his grand front door in a house that had every single advantage hers did not: the double walls, the great iron stove, the 80 cultivated acres standing behind it. And he stood there in his own warm doorway, shivering, and he looked down at that sled heaped with perfect, dry split wood, the precise way a starving man looks at bread through a bakery window. He went back into his pantry without a word, and he came out again with his arms full. A whole heavily smoked ham, 2 full pounds of cornmeal, a sealed crock of preserved beans, 6 pounds of good raw oats. It was a haul of vital winter calories that Maren could not have bought with 2 full weeks of breaking her back over the wash tub. He pressed the whole of it into her arms, and he could not quite bring himself to meet her eyes the entire time he did it, because both of them, standing there in that doorway, understood exactly and precisely what had just passed between them. The man on the gray horse who had held up his ruined hand to her like a flag and told her that she did not understand the country had just traded a portion of his own winter stores to a 16-year-old girl for the one single thing he, with all his experience, had failed to lay by for himself. The word of her surplus dry wood went through that frozen, frightened valley faster than any storm that winter. By the first week of February, the girl the town had thrown out into the snow to D was quietly supplying premium fuel to 5 of its most established and respectable families, and they paid her in a steady flowing stream of food and goods and small kindnesses that carried her clean through the worst of the deep freeze in something near to comfort. And not once, not one single time did she ever raise her price on a freezing family in their hour of need. She made fair, honest, even trades, the very same trade at every door she came to, and more than one household in Bismarck got itself through that historic deep freeze alive on the strength of dry wood that a discarded girl dragged to them through the snow on a hand sled. She had been cast out of the town as worthless. She was that February quietly keeping a good part of it alive. And then came the one gray morning that paid in full for every single thing that had come before it. In the last week of February, Conrad Voss came out to her door. The Prussian lumber dealer who had counted her last silver out slow into his own palm, with that small, tight smile, who had sold her a warped reject of a door, who had told her to her face that she was throwing her savings down into a muddy grave, stood now at her threshold out in the brutal cold, and he had come the 3 miles to beg her to sell him wood. When she pulled open the very same warped pine door he had mocked, a great wave of warm, clean air rolled out of the room and broke over his frozen face, and he stood there in it a moment, feeling it, his eyes half closing in spite of himself. And then he looked past her into the room, the clean-swept, dry floor, the glowing iron stove, the neat-hung shelves and the dry, preserved food, and the smooth-fitted pine boards of her breathing vault running level along the base of the wall. Every single thing he had sworn to her would rot and cave and drown. Standing whole and sound and warm in the 11th week of the very winter he had promised would kill her. He did not apologize. Men cut from the cloth of Conrad Voss rarely have the words in them for that. But something moved slow and deep behind his hard eyes. Something that cost him a great deal more than an apology ever would have, and was worth more for the costing. He contracted with her on the spot for regular deliveries of fuel through the remainder of the winter, a full dollar's worth of his premium hardware for every 3 days of her dry wood. And then the merchant in the man, the part of him that had built 17 houses and run a lumberyard across the whole hard breadth of a frontier, looked past the wood in her sled to the thing the wood was truly made of. He saw the principle of it. He saw all at once what her steady underground warmth and her bone-dry vault could be made to do at a scale far, far past the reach of one girl's stove. Every winter, he knew better than any man, the merchants of Bismarck lost a small fortune to spoilage. Root vegetables and barrels of apples and sacks of precious seed grain and bolts of good costly cloth froze solid in drafty sheds or rotted through in the damp summer heat. And there was not one thing any man among them could do about it, because no building raised above the ground could hold a steady, even temperature through the wild swing of a full Dakota year. But a large structure built true on her principles, dry and drained, and wrapped close in the patient, unmoving earth, holding a steady 50 degrees through every season of the year alike, would change the entire commerce of the town from the ground up. He made her an offer that would have been a staggering one for a grown man of 30, let alone for a girl of 16. He would finance every last dollar of the materials himself, he said, if she would agree to serve as the lead engineer and the architect of a great commercial storage dugout to be dug behind his lumberyard, built throughout on the exact methods she had invented and proven down in the bank of Apple Creek. She did not thank him and accept on the spot. She stood in her warm doorway and she negotiated. She had learned across that one long, brutal winter exactly what her hard-won knowledge was worth in the open market, and she was not about to hand it over to Conrad Voss for a wage and a word of thanks. $2 a week, she told him, level and cool through the whole length of the construction, and that, she said, was the small part of it. The large part was this: a permanent standing share of every fee the storage facility ever took in, paid over to her for just exactly as long as the structure stood and earned. And one thing more, she would do her own hiring for the digging, because she had learned that winter the hard outer limit of her own back, and she wanted Eli Pruitt, Harlan Pruitt's own eldest son, on the crew with a spade in his hands. The wealthy farmer's grown son, earning his day's wage, swinging a spade for a 16-year-old girl, building with her the very thing his father had ridden out in the snow to tell her could never, ever be a home. Conrad Voss stood in the cold and looked at her for a long moment, and then he agreed to the whole of it. They broke the hard ground in March, and they finished the structure by May. And what the two of them raised together was a true marvel set beside her own humble first shelter, 20 feet wide and a full 30 feet deep, with a ceiling that rose to 12 feet at the entrance. The drainage and the inward-leaning walls and the breathing-covered vault were all of them there. Everyone the same ideas she had carved into the creek bank, With her own bleeding hands the spring before, only Vast now scaled up into something a whole town could store its living in. By July, the place was running at a profit that Voss himself had not dared to imagine when he signed the papers. He let out the storage in blocks at 15 cents the week and filled the whole great room with 12 paying commercial clients inside the first month. One merchant, who had lost very near a full third of his apples to the freeze the winter before, lost less than one apple in 20 stored down in the cool, steady dark of the dugout. The patient earth had simply quietly abolished the old cruelty of the seasons inside those walls. Maren's permanent standing share came to roughly $4 in a month, and it fell into her open hands while she slept, while she did nothing at all to earn it twice. She thought sometimes in the quiet of the 35 cents a day she had once broken both her hands for of the cold puddles of thawing wood, of the unheated storeroom floor, and the pile of empty flour sacks. And she did not gloat over the distance she had come. She simply understood at last that the world had finally grudgingly agreed to pay her something near to what her father's patient teaching had been worth all along. And the money was the smaller of the two victories. The larger one came to her in August, and it came walking out to her door dressed in black. Father Emmett Doyle rode out to Apple Creek a second time, and this time he did not come alone. Walking beside his horse came a young stonemason, newly arrived in the territory out of Illinois, a serious, quiet, broad-shouldered man named Wesley Tunstall, and the priest had brought him the whole 3 miles out from town for one single reason. He asked Maren, the same girl he had once cornered on the trampled snow after Mass, and offered out of what he had honestly believed in his heart was God's own mercy, a servant's place in another family's house, whether she would consent to teach this young man the things that she knew. He asked it with his hat held in his two hands, an aging man who had set his certainty down somewhere along the hard road of that year and walked on lighter and truer for the leaving of it. She said that she would. She spent 3 full days at the side of Wesley Tunstall, teaching him to read the lay in the fall of a slope, to find the southern face that drank the winter sun, to lean a wall inward into the very weight that wanted to crush it flat, to send water away off downhill on nothing in the world but the patient, reliable, unfailing pull of the ground. Wesley Tunstall built his first dugout that same autumn along the Heart River, and it was flawless, and he went on from it to build 6 more of them, scattered across the territory off her methods and her plain hand-drawn plans, and not one single one of the 7 of them ever once flooded or rotted or fell. By the year 1881, Maren Vance had had her hand in 14 of the hyper-efficient earth-sheltered homes that were by then scattered across that hard country, dwellings that held families warm straight through the deep killing freeze and cool through the killing summer heat, sitting on land that a poor family did not have to be rich to hold. And with the money that came steadily into her, she filed at last a formal homestead claim, and she bought outright the full 160 acres of land that surrounded her own original $9 hole in the bank of Apple Creek. The patch of unclaimed open dirt that a discarded, slandered freezing girl had once crawled into on her hands and knees to keep from dying was hers now, every last acre of it, signed and sealed and recorded in the county book under her own name and no man's. In June of 1882, she married a Norwegian wheat farmer named Anders Halvorsen, a broad, slow, gentle man who had courted her carefully and patiently across a year and a half, and who understood the first time she sat him down and explained to him the trench and the breathing vault, exactly and precisely why her eyes lit the way they did when she spoke of them. They built a proper frame house together the following year, the very kind of house that the whole town had once stood in a line to insist that she absolutely must have to survive. but they never once tore down the dugout. The covered floor channel kept them in dry, seasoned wood year upon year, and the deep, steady warmth of the earth kept their family's food from spoiling long after they had any pressing need of either, because there are some things a person keeps not because they still must, but because of exactly what it cost them once to learn how to make them. The men who study such matters now look back at what a 16-year-old girl did alone in the winter of 1878, and they are quietly, profoundly astonished by it. The drainage channels she dug by firelight are the exact working principle of the modern systems that trained engineers now spend years of schooling learning how to specify. Her homemade mortar of dense clay and dead prairie grass was a natural composite, a binder reinforced with fiber, the very same idea that a far later and prouder century would congratulate itself on rediscovering and patenting. And her single greatest stroke, the breathing-covered vault, the heat she taught herself to draw down off the iron stove to dry her own fuel and warm her own floor and move the very air of her home all at once, was a flawless, intuitive execution of the principles of passive design that the wider world would not so much as put a proper name to until the energy crisis of the 1970s. Very near 100 full years after a slandered girl first dug it out of a frozen creek bank with her bleeding hands. Buildings raised today on her exact principles are known to cut the energy a house demands by as much as 70%. She herself never once knew any of those grand later names for the things that she had done. She only ever knew that her father had told her in a half-dug root cellar when she was 9 years old that the earth could be a friend to a person who treated it right, and that she had taken the man at his word and trusted him on the one bitter morning when no other soul on God's earth would. There is a letter kept to this day folded deep in the Bismarck Historical Archives written in the year 1885 by Father Emmett Doyle to his regional bishop. In that letter, the old priest names Maren Vance directly by her name, and he confesses in his own careful hand that this young woman had taught him a hard lesson in Christian humility that he had needed the whole of his life and had never once expected to receive at the hands of a girl. He had presumed, he wrote in the pride of his office, to know exactly what kind of shelter a young woman required to live, when the plain truth of it was that she had understood the hard, merciless reality of that Dakota land far, far better than any man who had ever ridden out to lecture her upon it. Conrad Voss's great commercial storage dugout ran on without a single failure until the year 1912. And Harlan Pruitt himself stood up before his neighbors at a county fair in the year 1905 and praised her engineering aloud in the open, with his ruined three-fingered hand resting easy on the rail in front of him. The very last record that survives of her is the Montana census of the year 1920. It lists her there plainly as Maren Halverson, a widow. 58 years of age, her occupation set down by the census taker in a single dry word: farm woman. There is no mention anywhere in that one dry official line of the physics she had mastered alone, nor of the 14 families she had sheltered from the cold, nor of the 4 certain and respected men she had silenced one by one without ever once raising her voice above its even level pitch. But her first dugout, her own, still stood whole and intact and sound as late as the year 1904. And one photograph of it survives, taken in 1890, that shows the roof grown thick and green and deep with heavy prairie grass, and the drainage ditch worn deep and smooth by a decade of faithful, silent, unfailing work, and the 4 small, salvaged panes of window glass looking quietly out still over the frozen creek that had given her every single thing she had in the season, when the whole rest of the world had given her nothing at all. She had been thrown out into a 14 below zero night with a dead man's hammer and $4 silver and a lie told about her by the very people who were sworn to keep her. Every voice of authority that she met along her way told her kindly and unkindly both that the earth would surely be her enemy, that her plan was a slow suicide, that a girl alone simply could not survive the thing that she had set her hand to. She heard out every last one of them politely every single time. And then she walked down into the cold, dark, patient dirt, and she proved with her own two bleeding hands that quiet intelligence and an honest, humble partnership with the natural world will always, in the long end, outlast the loudest certainty of men who never once troubled themselves to look closely enough at the ground to learn what it was trying to tell them. The earth was never her enemy. It was in the end the one steady friend in all her life that never once turned its face away from her. She had only ever needed to know how to ask it, and she had known.